The teacup in Margaret Pritchard's hand slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that followed Mrs. Hartwell's scream. Dr. Pritchard was on his feet immediately, his professional instincts overriding the social paralysis that gripped the others. James Hartwell moved toward the doorway, his face draining of color, while Catherine remained perfectly still, her hands gripping the armrests of her settee so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her needles clicking softly as she placed them in her bag. She rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone accustomed to the limitations of age, her expression revealing nothing of the sharp attention that had immediately focused on every detail in the room. The others were already moving, drawn by the magnetic pull of crisis, but Miss Marple followed at her own measured pace, observing as she went. The kitchen at Thornfield Manor was a large, well-appointed room that spoke of both comfort and careful economy. Mrs. Hartwell stood near the far counter, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes fixed on the floor. On the polished tiles beneath the sink lay the body of Mr. Reginald Hartwell, the patriarch of the family, dressed in his typical country gentleman's attire of tweed jacket and wool trousers. His face was turned slightly away, and his left arm lay at an awkward angle beneath his body. A substantial bruise was already forming on his right temple, dark and vicious against his pale skin. "Good heavens," Dr. Pritchard breathed, moving swiftly to kneel beside the body. He checked for a pulse with professional efficiency, then looked up at the assembled group with the expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. "He's been dead for some time. Several hours, I should think. The body temperature suggests—" He stopped himself, glancing at Mrs. Hartwell's face. "We must telephone the police immediately." James Hartwell moved to his mother, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. She seemed diminished suddenly, her earlier precision of manner replaced by something more fragile and uncertain. Catherine had followed the others into the kitchen and stood in the doorway, her face an unreadable mask, though her right hand trembled slightly as it hung at her side. "He must have fallen," Margaret Pritchard said quietly, her whisper of a voice barely audible. "The floor is rather slippery, isn't it? With the rain and everything, one could easily slip." Miss Marple's eyes moved across the kitchen floor, taking in the arrangement of furniture, the position of the body, the subtle details that others in their shock and distress might overlook. She noted that the floor near the sink was indeed slightly damp, though the rest of the kitchen appeared perfectly dry. She observed, too, that there was a small wooden stool near the counter, the kind used for reaching upper cupboards, and it lay on its side approximately 3 feet from the body. A dish towel hung neatly folded on the rack beside the sink, pristine and undisturbed. "I'll telephone the police," David Thornton said, his solicitor's mind already moving toward the practical necessities of such a situation. He seemed the least affected by the discovery, his composure intact even as the others remained paralyzed by shock. "James, perhaps we should move your mother to the drawing room. She shouldn't remain here." James nodded gratefully and began to guide his mother away from the kitchen. Catherine followed them, but Miss Marple observed that she paused briefly at the doorway, turning back to look at her father's body with an expression that seemed more analytical than grief-stricken. It was a fleeting moment, quickly masked when Catherine realized that Miss Marple was watching her, but it registered in the older woman's mind with the precision of a photograph. Dr. Pritchard remained kneeling beside the body, his professional manner now tinged with the awkwardness of someone who had discovered a colleague's body in unusual circumstances. He reached out carefully to examine the wound on Reginald's temple, his fingers hovering just above the skin without quite touching it. Miss Marple, who had moved to stand near the counter, observed that the doctor seemed hesitant, as if he were uncertain about something. "The wound appears to have been caused by a blunt object," the doctor said quietly, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "Consistent with striking one's head on the corner of the counter, perhaps, or on this stool if one had fallen from it, while attempting to reach something in the upper cupboards." Yet even as he spoke these words, Miss Marple noticed that his eyes betrayed doubt. She had known Edmund Pritchard for many years, had observed him professionally and socially throughout their long coexistence in the village, and she recognized the subtle signs of a man who did not quite believe his own explanation. The rain continued its persistent drumming against the kitchen windows, and in the distance, the first hints of sirens could be heard, growing steadily louder. The peaceful autumn afternoon had transformed into something altogether different. The garden party, that reliable fixture of village social life, had metamorphosed into a crime scene, and though no one had yet explicitly acknowledged what Miss Marple already suspected, the thought hung unspoken in the kitchen's suddenly oppressive air. Reginald Hartwell had not simply fallen, he had been murdered. Inspector Michael Blackwell arrived at Thornfield Manor within 20 minutes. A man, F-52, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent 3 decades observing humanity at its worst. He moved through the kitchen with the assured efficiency of long practice, his sharp grey eyes cataloguing details with mechanical precision. Behind him came Sergeant William Foster, a younger man whose notebook was already open, ready to record statements and observations. The inspector examined the body without touching it, crouching beside Reginald Hartwell's remains with a thoughtfulness that suggested he was seeing something beyond the merely physical. He studied the wound on the temple, the position of the arms, the scatter of grey hair against the pale skin. Then he rose slowly, his knees protesting slightly, and turned to Dr. Pritchard with an expression of professional curiosity. "Your initial assessment, Doctor?" Inspector Blackwell asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "A fall, it would appear," Dr. Pritchard replied, though his tone remained uncertain. "Struck his head, likely on the counter corner, or perhaps the stool. The wound is consistent with blunt force trauma, resulting from a domestic accident." The inspector nodded slowly, yet his eyes continued to move around the kitchen, examining the floor, the positioning of furniture, the cupboards above the counter. He approached the stool and, using a handkerchief to avoid contaminating any potential evidence, lifted it carefully. The bottom surface revealed nothing remarkable. No blood, no hair, no sign of contact with the victim. "When was Mr. Hartwell last seen alive?" Inspector Blackwell asked, turning his attention back to the kitchen's observers. It was James Hartwell who answered, his voice strained from the effort of maintaining composure. "This morning, Inspector. He was in his study when I came downstairs for breakfast at approximately 8 o'clock. Mother was with guests by then, preparing for the party. Catherine had already left for school in town, and no one checked on him during the party. He rarely joined Mother's social gatherings," James explained. "Father preferred his study. It wasn't unusual for him to remain there during the afternoon." Miss Marple, who had remained quietly in the corner of the kitchen near the doorframe, listened to this exchange with the careful attention she brought to all human interaction. She watched how James's jaw tightened when he spoke of his father's isolation, observed the way Catherine's hands trembled as she stood beside her mother in the drawing-room doorway, noted the particular quality of Mrs. Hartwell's silence, not the silence of grief, but something more complex and controlled. Inspector Blackwell began his preliminary examination of the room itself. He opened the cupboards above the counter where the stool had been positioned, finding ordinary household items, plates, glasses, serving dishes, nothing that would suggest a reason for Reginald to have been standing on an unstable stool. The inspector's frown deepened slightly, a barely perceptible shift in his expression that suggested his skepticism regarding the accidental fall theory was growing. "Has anyone moved anything in this kitchen since the body was discovered?" he asked sharply. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been standing motionless since the police arrived, shook her head. "I came in to fetch cups for tea. I saw him there and screamed. I didn't touch anything. I simply ran back to the drawing room." The inspector examined the floor more carefully now, noting the damp patch near the sink and the pristine condition of the dish towel. He opened the cupboard beneath the sink, finding cleaning supplies and a waste bin arranged with meticulous organization. Everything in the kitchen spoke of careful maintenance and orderly habits. "When was this floor last cleaned?" the inspector asked. "This morning, Inspector," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "Our housekeeper, Mrs. Evans, comes in on Mondays and Fridays to do a thorough cleaning. Today being Friday, she would have finished before 9 o'clock. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this detail. If the floor had been cleaned in the morning, was now damp in only one particular location, that suggested something specific about the timing and circumstances of Reginald's death. She caught Dr. Pritchard's eye briefly, and something in his expression suggested that he too had recognized the significance of this detail. Inspector Blackwell stood in the center of the kitchen, his hands clasped loosely before him, his eyes moving from face to face. "I'll need statements from everyone present this afternoon, beginning with the immediate family. Sergeant Foster will take initial information. Dr. Pritchard, if you could examine the body more thoroughly and provide a preliminary time of death estimate, I would appreciate it." As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple remained where she stood, her eyes still moving across the kitchen with unhurried observation. She noticed the pattern of moisture on the floor, the peculiar arrangement of the overturned stool, the absence of any clear explanation for why Reginald Hartwell would have been attempting to retrieve items from a cupboard at an hour when his housekeeper had already completed her morning cleaning. Most significantly, she observed that Catherine Hartwell had turned away from the inspector's questioning, her shoulders suddenly rigid, her breathing deliberately controlled. The rain continued outside, relentless and patient, washing away the day's external evidence, while the internal mysteries of Thornfield Manor remained carefully concealed behind polite facades and practiced restraint. The drawing room at Thornfield Manor had transformed into an informal interrogation chamber, though Inspector Blackwell maintained the pretense of casual conversation to avoid alarming the family unnecessarily. Mrs. Hartwell sat rigidly on the settee, her hands folded in her lap with such precision that it suggested conscious effort rather than natural repose. James occupied the chair beside her, his attention divided between his mother and the inspector, while Catherine stood near the window, her silhouette framed against the grey afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. "Your father was a man of regular habits, I take it?" Inspector Blackwell asked, settling into the chair across from Mrs. Hartwell with the casualness of someone conducting an ordinary conversation rather than a murder inquiry. "Very regular indeed," Mrs. Hartwell replied, her voice steady despite the tremor that occasionally betrayed her composure. Breakfast at 7:30, his study by 8 o'clock, luncheon at 1, and then back to his study until dinner at 7. He was a creature of absolute routine. It was one of his defining characteristics. And this afternoon? Did anyone speak with him after the party began? James shook his head. Mother mentioned that she'd seen him in his study this morning, but the party was well underway by 2:30. Father made it quite clear years ago that he had no interest in attending Mother's social gatherings. He considered them frivolous, I believe. Miss Marple, who had taken a seat in the corner with her knitting needles once again clicking softly, observed the exchange with her characteristic attention to nuance. She noted that James's description of his father's disapproval seemed to carry a weight of resentment beneath its factual presentation, and she observed too that Catherine's fingers had begun to drum against the window, rame in a rhythm that suggested anxiety, or perhaps something else entirely. "What sort of work did your father occupy himself with in his study?" The inspector continued, his pen poised over his notebook. "He was a financier, retired some 15 years ago," Mrs. Hartwell explained, "though he maintained various investments and business interests that required his attention. He was also writing what he called his memoirs, though I never saw them progress beyond the first chapter." Inspector Blackwell's eyebrow rose slightly at this. He had significant wealth, then? The question hung in the air with implications that seemed to make James uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, and Catherine turned from the window with sudden focus, her earlier detachment replaced by sharp attention. "My father was comfortable," Mrs. Hartwell said carefully. "He was not ostentatiously wealthy, but he had ensured our family's security through prudent investments and careful management." "And his will?" the inspector asked with a directness that came from long experience with inheritance as a motive for murder. "Who would benefit from his death?" There was a pause, a moment of silence that seemed to expand and fill the room like water rising. It was Catherine who answered, her voice carrying a note of defiance that suggested she had anticipated this question and decided on honesty rather than evasion. "The estate is divided equally between James and myself, Inspector. The house, the investments, everything passes to us in equal shares. Mother receives the income from the estate during her lifetime, but upon her death, The property reverts to us. And your father's solicitor can confirm this arrangement? Mr. David Thornton has handled our family's legal matters for over 20 years, James said. He can provide you with copies of the will. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic clicking, yet her eyes had lifted from her work to observe the faces of those around her. She was a woman who understood that silence often spoke louder than speech, and she noted with particular interest the absence of visible grief in either James or Catherine. Mrs. Hartwell, by contrast, seemed to be experiencing a form of delayed shock, her composure maintained through sheer force of will rather than genuine emotional steadiness. Inspector Blackwell rose from his chair and moved to the fireplace, where he stood examining the mantelpiece with seeming casualness. "I notice there are no photographs of your father on display, Mrs. Hartwell. That's rather unusual for a family home." Mrs. Hartwell stiffened almost imperceptibly. "My husband had no patience with sentiment, Inspector. He disliked being photographed and refused to allow family portraits to be displayed. He considered them a form of vanity. A man of strong opinions, it would seem," the inspector mused, turning back to face the family. "And yet someone in this house, or someone with access to this house, felt strongly enough about something to strike him down. That suggests either a sudden crisis of passion or a carefully considered decision." The rain intensified against the windows, drumming with increasing urgency as if the weather itself was responding to the tension in the room. Catherine had returned her gaze to the window, though her shoulders remained rigid, and James had begun to drum his fingers on the armrest in a pattern that mirrored his sister's earlier anxiety. Mrs. Hartwell sat perfectly still, but Miss Marple observed that a small muscle at the corner of her jaw had begun to twitch, betraying the emotional turmoil she was working so carefully to conceal. "I believe I should like to examine your father's study," Inspector Blackwell announced, his tone making it clear this was not a request, but a directive. Perhaps his recent activities might illuminate his state of mind and any potential sources of conflict. As James rose to lead the inspector upstairs, Miss Marple's eyes followed Catherine, who remained at the window with the intensity of someone watching for a specific sight beyond the rain-obscured glass. Reginald Hartwell's study was a room that spoke volumes about the man himself, austere, orderly, and somehow profoundly lonely. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on finance, history, and philosophy, arranged with military precision according to some system known only to their owner. The desk, positioned to face the door, was remarkably bare, containing only a leather blotter, an inkwell, and a fountain pen placed at a perfect right angle to the desk's edge. A leather wing-back chair sat behind the desk, and beside it, a small side table held a glass containing the remnants of what had likely been whiskey, now turned amber-brown with age. Inspector Blackwell entered with James trailing behind, his eyes immediately drawn to the orderliness of the space. He moved to the desk without touching anything, his professional gaze cataloguing details with the precision of a man who had learned that seemingly insignificant objects often contained the seeds of significant truths. "Your father kept meticulous records, I see," the inspector observed, examining the single drawer visible in the desk's front panel. "May I?" James nodded, and Inspector Blackwell carefully opened the drawer using his handkerchief as insulation against potential fingerprints. Inside lay correspondence, neatly bundled and organized by date, along with several leather-bound account books. The inspector withdrew one at random and opened it to find columns of figures, annotations in a precise hand, and what appeared to be detailed records of financial transactions spanning several months. "These are recent?" the inspector asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I assume so, Inspector. Father kept detailed records of all his investments and financial matters. He was obsessive about documentation." Miss Marple, who had quietly followed the two men upstairs, despite not being explicitly invited to do so, stood in the doorway observing the scene. The other guests had been asked to remain in the drawing-room under Sergeant Foster's watchful eye, but Miss Marple had discovered long ago that people often became so focused on the central investigation that they overlooked an elderly woman whose presence seemed almost furniture-like in its unobtrusive quality. Inspector Blackwell set aside the account books and turned his attention to the bookshelves. He ran his finger along several volumes, examining their spines with interest, before withdrawing a slim ledger bound in dark leather that appeared to be distinct from the others. The title on its spine read, "Personal Correspondence, Private." "Interesting," the inspector murmured, opening the ledger carefully. His eyes moved across the pages, and his expression shifted, a subtle hardening of features that suggested he had encountered something of significance. "Your father maintained records of his personal correspondence as well? That's rather thorough." James leaned forward to look, but the inspector angled the ledger away with a subtle movement that made clear he preferred to examine it privately. Miss Marple, from her vantage point in the doorway, caught sight of several names written in the ledger's pages before Inspector Blackwell closed it carefully. She recognized one immediately, David Thornton, the village solicitor. Another name appeared multiple times. Catherine H. A. Third, partially obscured, seemed to read something with the initials M.P. Thaug. She could not quite discern the full surname. "I shall need to take these records with me for more thorough examination," the inspector said, setting the ledger and the account books on the desktop. "They may prove relevant to understanding your father's state of mind and any potential sources of conflict." "Of course, Inspector," James replied, though his voice had taken on a strained quality that suggested the sight of his father's private documentation had disturbed him in ways he was working to conceal. Inspector Blackwell moved to the side table and examined the glass containing the whiskey residue. He lifted it carefully, observing its interior and the way the liquid clung to the glass sides. "When was this last cleaned?" "I'm not certain, Inspector. Mrs. Evans handles the cleaning, and I don't believe Father would have allowed her to touch anything in his study. He was quite particular about his space." "So this glass could have been sitting here for days, possibly weeks?" "Possibly, yes." The inspector set the glass down and turned his attention to the chair behind the desk. He ran his hand over its leather surface, examining the wear pattern and the position of the chair relative to the desk itself. Then he stepped back, creating a mental map of the room's geography and the man who occupied it. "Your father sat here daily, reviewing his finances, conducting his correspondence?" the inspector asked, more as a statement than a question. "Yes, typically for several hours each day, and yet he apparently left his study this afternoon to go to the kitchen, where he fell and struck his head on the counter. That seems inconsistent with his routine, doesn't it? Particularly given that your mother had already engaged a housekeeper to manage domestic tasks." James appeared to consider this objection, and a frown of uncertainty crossed his features. I'm not cert." "Ain't what you mean, Inspector. Father may have needed something from the kitchen. It wouldn't have required an explanation." "Perhaps not," Inspector Blackwell agreed, though his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. "Yet it remains notable that a man of such rigid routine would deviate from his established patterns. In my experience, such deviations often prove significant." Miss Marple, still standing quietly in the doorway, observed that James had begun to shift his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle sign of anxiety that few would notice but which she recognized immediately. She turned her attention to the room itself, allowing her eyes to move across its surfaces and contents, and she noticed something that appeared to have escaped the inspector's observation. A small mark on the floor near the desk chair, as if something heavy had been recently moved. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the study windows, and somewhere in the house below, the rest of the Hartwell family waited, each harboring secrets that the afternoon's violence had brought dangerously close to exposure. By early evening, the rain had begun to ease, though the sky remained heavy and threatening, as if the storm merely paused for breath before recommencing its assault on the village. Inspector Blackwell had established himself in Thornfield Manor's library, using it as a temporary headquarters from which to conduct his investigation. The personal ledger and account books from Reginald's study lay spread across the mahogany table before him, and Sergeant Foster stood nearby, his notebook filled with the preliminary statements collected from all those present during the garden party. Miss Marple had been permitted to remain at Thornfield Manor under the pretext of providing additional information about the afternoon's events, though in reality both she and the Inspector understood that her presence served a different purpose entirely. She sat in a high-backed chair near the library's fireplace, her knitting resumed with patient regularity, her eyes moving between the work in her hands and the subtle interplay of expression and body language among those around her. Inspector Blackwell looked up from the ledger he had been examining with increasing absorption. His face bore the particular intensity of someone who had discovered information that contradicted the surface narrative of events. He rose and moved to the library doorway, where he called for James Hartwell to return for a more detailed conversation. When James entered, the inspector gestured toward one of the chairs across from where he stood. "I've been examining your father's personal correspondence records, Mr. Hartwell. It appears he maintained quite detailed documentation of his interactions with various individuals. I noticed that Catherine's name appears in these records with some frequency, along with rather pointed notations regarding financial matters. Can you explain the nature of these entries?" James's face underwent a subtle transformation, the careful mask of controlled composure slipping slightly to reveal genuine distress beneath. "I'm not entirely certain what you found, Inspector, but Catherine and Father had been in considerable disagreement regarding her inheritance and her future." "Disagreement?" the inspector pressed. "Your sister is a schoolteacher, I understand. Hardly a profession that requires paternal approval or financial arrangements. Catherine wished to pursue further education abroad," James explained, his voice carrying the weight of long-standing family conflict. "She wanted to study at a university in Switzerland, to obtain credentials that would allow her to teach at a higher level. Father refused to fund the endeavor. He believed such aspirations were inappropriate for a woman of her station and circumstance. There were considerable arguments between them on the subject." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly at this revelation, though she offered no other indication of her interest. She was aware, through the village's reliable network of gossip, that Catherine Hartwell had indeed applied to a Swiss university several years prior, and that her application had been accepted. She was also aware that Catherine had declined the opportunity, citing family obligations. The revelation that Reginald had refused to finance his daughter's ambitions added significant dimension to the portrait of the dead man that was gradually emerging. "And this disagreement remained unresolved?" the inspector asked. "As of this morning, yes," James admitted. Catherine had broached the subject again during breakfast, suggesting that Father reconsider his position. He refused quite vehemently. Catherine left for school immediately afterward, upset but controlled. Inspector Blackwell made a notation in his own small notebook, then returned his attention to the personal ledger. "I also note that David Thornton's name appears with considerable frequency in your father's records, often accompanied by notations that suggest your father questioned Mr. Thornton's handling of certain financial matters. Was there tension between your father and his solicitor?" James hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the weight of knowledge he was reluctant to share. Father had begun to suspect that his investments were not performing as Mr. Thornton had represented. He had engaged an independent financial auditor to review his portfolio. The auditor's preliminary findings suggested that there may have been irregularities in how certain funds had been managed. "Irregularities?" The inspector's tone sharpened. "You mean to say that your father believed his solicitor had been misappropriating funds?" "I cannot make such an accusation based solely on preliminary findings," James replied carefully, the solicitor's son within him asserting itself. But Father was convinced enough to have scheduled a formal confrontation with Mr. Thornton for this very afternoon, following the garden party's conclusion. At this revelation, Miss Marple's attention intensified, though she maintained her knitting's steady rhythm. A confrontation scheduled for the afternoon. A confrontation that would never occur because Reginald Hartwell lay dead in his kitchen, his head fractured from blunt force trauma, his financial disputes forever unresolved. "Your father had informed Mr. Thornton of this scheduled meeting?" the inspector asked sharply. "I'm not certain," James admitted. "Father may have chosen to approach him unexpectedly. That was his nature. He preferred to observe people's reactions when they were unprepared for his accusations." Inspector Blackwell stood abruptly, his mind clearly working through the implications of this new information. "And where precisely is Mr. Thornton at this moment?" "In the drawing room with the others, I believe," James replied. Sergeant Foster asked all guests to remain available for further questioning. The inspector moved toward the library door, then paused, turning back to regard James with penetrating intensity. "One final question, Mr. Hartwell. This morning, when you saw your father in his study at breakfast time, did he mention anything unusual? Any plans for the afternoon beyond his typical routine?" James shook his head slowly. "Nothing unusual, Inspector. He simply reviewed his correspondence and drank his coffee. He seemed preoccupied, perhaps, but father was frequently preoccupied with matters of finance." After James departed, the inspector stood in contemplative silence, his gaze fixed on the rain-darkened window. Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting how his mind was working through the puzzle pieces that were gradually being assembled into a coherent pattern. She rose from her chair with deliberate slowness and approached the library table where the personal ledger lay open. "May I?" she asked quietly, gesturing toward the document. Inspector Blackwell seemed surprised by her request, but after a moment's consideration, he stepped aside to permit her access. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the ledger's pages with the same meticulous attention she had always brought to observation of human nature. Her eyes moved across the notations, cataloguing details, connecting patterns, and gradually a picture emerged that was distinctly different from the one Inspector Blackwell appeared to have formed. "Interesting," she murmured to herself, her aged voice carrying the weight of sudden comprehension. "You've noticed something, Miss Marple?" Inspector Blackwell asked, his professional instincts immediately alert to the subtle shift in the elderly woman's demeanor. He had encountered her before in various village matters, and he had learned to respect her observations, however peripheral she might appear to be. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, straightening her spectacles, "though I should hesitate to draw conclusions without considerably more information. However, I do find it curious that Mr. Thornton's name appears in these records with such frequency, and yet the notations seem to shift in character approximately 6 months ago. Prior to that date, the entries are largely administrative, references to investment reviews and routine financial matters. After that date, however, the tone becomes distinctly accusatory. The word discrepancies appears repeatedly, along with what appears to be calculations and cross-references. Inspect." Or Blackwell leaned closer to examine the pages she indicated. "You're suggesting that your father's suspicions regarding Mr. Thornton are of relatively recent origin." "That would appear to be the case," Miss Marple agreed. "Which raises the question of what prompted this sudden shift in his assessment of his solicitor's trustworthiness. Men such as your father, meticulous, obsessive about detail, do not typically reverse their opinions regarding professional relationships without significant provocation." The inspector nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the implications. "I shall need to interview Mr. Thornton more thoroughly. His financial records, his relationship with the Hartwell family, his potential motives, all of these require careful examination." "Indeed," Miss Marple said quietly. "Though I would suggest, Inspector, that you also consider the question of opportunity and physical capacity. A man must not only possess motive, but also the practical ability to commit a crime. Mr. Thornton, while perhaps financially motivated, would have required access to the kitchen at the precise moment when Mr. Hartwell was present there. Moreover, the violence required to deliver such a wound suggests either considerable physical strength or a specific familiarity with how to inflict maximum damage with minimal effort." Inspector Blackwell regarded the elderly woman with renewed respect. "You're suggesting that we should consider not merely who had motive, but who had both motive and the practical means to act upon it." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "And in my experience, Inspector, such combinations are rarely accidental. They suggest either premeditation or a sudden crisis in which someone acted with surprising decisiveness. Before the inspector could respond, Sergeant Foster appeared in the library doorway, his expression suggesting he carried informatio, N of significance. "Inspector, we've discovered something you should see. One of the household staff mentioned that Mr. Hartwell had asked for a specific ledger to be retrieved from his study this morning, a ledger that is not currently present in the study. According to the housekeeper, Mrs. Evans, she observed him carrying what appeared to be a leather-bound volume downstairs around 11:30, shortly after Mr. Thornton's arrival for the garden party. Mr. Thornton arrived before the party officially began, the inspector asked sharply. Apparently so, sir. He came through the back entrance approximately half an hour before the scheduled start time. Mrs. Evans mentioned it because it seemed unusual. Mr. Thornton typically arrives with the other guests rather than early. Inspector Blackwell's jaw tightened, and he turned back to examine the study's documents with renewed intensity. Sergeant, I want you to conduct a thorough search of the entire house for any leather-bound ledgers that may not be accounted for in the study. Check the drawing room, the library, even the kitchens and servants' quarters. And summon Mr. Thornton for formal questioning immediately. Miss Marple remained quiet as the sergeant departed, but her eyes followed Inspector Blackwell as he began to construct a more complex narrative of the afternoon's events. She had observed something in the ledger that she had not yet shared with the inspector, a notation in a different hand than Reginald's own, a hasty addition to one of the pages that suggested someone else had had access to the document and had felt compelled to make alterations or additions to its contents. Within minutes, David Thornton was ushered into the library by Sergeant Foster. The solicitor appeared composed, though his earlier unflappable demeanor had become noticeably strained. He carried himself with the careful precision of a man who understood that his every movement was being observed and analyzed. Mr. Thornton, Inspector Blackwell began, his tone suggesting this was no longer a casual inquiry, but a formal interrogation. I understand you arrived at Thornfield Manor earlier than the scheduled time for the garden party. Can you explain the reason for this early arrival? David Thornton's hands tightened slightly on the armrests of the chair into which he had been gestured. I arrived early to speak with Mr. Hartwell regarding a matter of some importance. There were financial documents requiring his attention, and I thought it best to address them before the guests arrived and claimed his attention. And did you speak with Mr. Hartwell? Briefly, yes. He was in his study. We discussed the matter for perhaps 10 minutes, and then he asked me to join the garden party while he attended to other business. What specific matter required your urgent attention? The inspector pressed. Thornton hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the weight of secrets that he had been working to conceal. A routine investment review, Inspector. Nothing more than ordinary professional business. Miss Marple observed his face carefully as he spoke these words, and she noted the particular quality of the lie. Not an outright falsehood, but a carefully constructed partial truth that omitted significant details while remaining technically accurate. She had encountered this form of deception many times before in the village, and she recognized it as the refuge of those who possessed genuinely guilty knowledge, but believed they could navigate interrogation through careful evasion. The rain began again outside, harder than before, as if the weather itself was responding to the mounting tensions within Thornfield Manor's walls. Inspector Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he studied David Thornton's carefully composed expression. A routine investment review, you say? Yet your early arrival suggests considerable urgency. Routine matters are typically addressed during scheduled office appointments, not through surprise visits before social gatherings commence. Mr. Hartwell preferred to handle certain matters discreetly, Thornton replied, maintaining his facade of professional courtesy despite the obvious strain beneath its surface. He was a man who valued privacy in his financial affairs. I accommodated his preferences. I see, the inspector said, though his tone suggested the opposite. He rose from behind the library table and moved to a small side table where he had arranged several documents. I've been reviewing your professional relationship with Mr. Hartwell, Mr. Thornton. It spans, according to the family, approximately 20 years. A considerable period of trust and professional association. Yet I find it curious that his personal ledger contains numerous entries suggesting his confidence in that relationship had undergone substantial erosion in recent months. Thornton's composure wavered fractionally, a barely perceptible crack in the facade he had constructed. Mr. Hartwell was a man prone to suspicion. He questioned everything, questioned everyone. It was simply his nature. Suspicion born of paranoia, or suspicion born of legitimate concern. The inspector countered. He withdrew a sheet of paper from among his documents. I've taken the liberty of requesting preliminary information from the financial auditor whom Mr. Hartwell engaged independently. The auditor's initial assessment suggests that approximately £40,000 has been transferred from Mr. Hartwell's investment accounts over the past 18 months through a series of transactions that were documented but which lack clear justification or transparency regarding their ultimate destination. The colour drained visibly from Thornton's face at this revelation. He gripped the armrests of his chair more firmly, and his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining vocal control. "I can explain those transactions, Inspector. They were entirely legitimate investments in opportunities that Mr. Hartwell himself authorized." "Did he?" the inspector asked sharply. "Because according to his personal ledger, Mr. Hartwell explicitly questioned each of these transactions and expressed significant doubt regarding both their legitimacy and the financial returns they were purported to generate. In fact, his final notation on this subject, dated merely 3 days ago, contains the phrase, 'I have been systematically defrauded.' Those are rather serious accusations, Mr. Thornton." Miss Marple, who had continued her knitting throughout this exchange, observed the play of emotion across Thornton's features with the acute attention she brought to all human suffering. She recognized in his face the particular anguish of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing, whose secrets were being methodically exposed, and whose professional reputation was disintegrating before his eyes. "Mr. Hartwell was mistaken," Thornton said finally, his voice strained. "The investments were sound. The returns were simply delayed due to market conditions beyond my control. I fully intended to restore any temporary discrepancies from my own resources once the market conditions improved." "You intended to restore them?" The inspector's tone carried unmistakable skepticism. "That suggests you acknowledge that discrepancies exist. Yet moments ago you claimed these transactions were entirely legitimate and properly authorized." Thornton fell silent, the contradiction between his successive statements hanging in the air between them like a physical sense. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose slowly from her chair, moving to stand beside Inspector Blackwell with the unobtrusive grace that had always characterized her movements. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I inquire whether Mr. Thornton arrived at Thornfield Manor carrying any documents or parcels this afternoon?" The inspector turned to regard her with renewed interest. "An excellent question, Miss Marple. Sergeant Foster, did you observe Mr. Thornton carrying anything when he arrived?" The sergeant consulted his notes. "According to Mrs. Evans, the housekeeper, Mr. Thornton carried only his briefcase, Inspector, a leather case of some size, though she made no note of what it contained." "And does Mr. Thornton still possess this briefcase?" the inspector asked, gesturing toward Thornton, who sat in rigid silence. "It's in the drawing room, sir, with the other guests' personal effects," Sergeant Foster replied. "Retrieve it," Inspector Blackwell commanded, "and do so carefully. If there is evidence within it, we shall want to preserve its integrity for examination." As the sergeant departed, Miss Marple returned her attention to David Thornton. "You know, Mr. Thornton, in my many years observing human nature, I have found that men who commit financial crimes often do so not out of simple greed, but out of desperation born of circumstances beyond their control. I wonder, for instance, whether you have had recent personal difficulties, family troubles perhaps, or debts incurred through no fault of your own." Thornton's eyes met hers briefly, and in that brief contact she saw confirmation of her intuition. She had struck upon the fundamental truth that motivated his crimes, not malice toward Reginald Hartwell, but desperation born of personal crisis. "My wife has been undergoing treatment for a serious illness," Thornton said quietly, his voice stripped of its professional veneer. "The costs have been considerable, beyond what I could manage through legitimate means. I borrowed from Mr. Hartwell's account with the full intention of repaying the funds once my financial situation stabilized. It was a mistake, yes, but it was born of desperation rather than criminal intent. A sympathetic motivation, certainly," Inspector Blackwell said, his tone carrying a note of genuine compassion. "Yet it does not address the central question of your whereabouts during the relevant time period this afternoon, nor does it explain why you felt compelled to meet with Mr. Hartwell in private before the garden party commenced." Thornton's face had become a study in conflict, the man clearly wrestling with decisions that carried profound consequences. Before he could respond, Sergeant Foster returned, carrying the leather briefcase in question. He set it carefully on the library table and stepped back, awaiting the inspector's instructions. Inspector Blackwell approached the briefcase with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that the objects contained within it might provide crucial evidence regarding the afternoon's violence. Using a handkerchief to insulate his fingers from potential fingerprints, he released the latches and opened the case to reveal its contents. Inside lay several manila folders containing financial documents, a leather-bound journal similar to those found in Reginald's study, and, most notably, a second personal ledger that appeared to match the description of the missing volume that Mrs. Evans had observed Reginald carrying downstairs that morning. "Interesting," the inspector murmured, withdrawing the ledger with careful precision. He opened it to examine its pages, and his expression underwent a subtle transformation as he encountered entries written in Reginald Hartwell's precise hand, alongside notations in what appeared to be Thornton's hurried script, additions and corrections that suggested a conversation between accuser and accused, rendered in physical form. Miss Marple moved closer to observe the ledger's contents, her aged eyes moving across the pages with focused intensity. She noted the progression of entries, the escalating accusations, the desperate rebuttals, and the final notation in Reginald's hand that read, "Confrontation scheduled for 4 p.m. Thornton must be made to understand that this deception shall not continue. The withdrawal of funds begins immediately." "The withdrawal of funds," Inspector Blackwell repeated, his voice carrying the weight of sudden comprehension. "Mr. Thornton, this notation suggests that Mr. Hartwell intended to take decisive action regarding the disputed funds. What exactly did you discuss during your private conversation this morning?" David Thornton remained silent for a prolonged moment, his face a portrait of internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He knew everything, Inspector. I had believed myself clever, had thought the transactions sufficiently obscured that he would never uncover them. But Reginald was far more meticulous than I had anticipated. He had engaged an auditor, and the auditor had identified every transfer, every discrepancy. And what did he propose to do with this information?" The inspector pressed. "He intended to report me to the authorities," Thornton replied, his voice hollow with defeat. "He said I had betrayed his trust, that I had committed a crime, and that he would not permit such dishonor to attach itself to his family's name without ensuring appropriate legal consequences. He gave me until 4 o'clock this afternoon to meet with him privately to discuss the matter before he contacted Scotland Yard." Miss Marple's needles, which she had read, reeved from her bag, while the inspector examined the ledger, began their rhythmic clicking once more. She had not yet concluded her investigation, for something about Thornton's explanation troubled her. The desperation in his voice was genuine, his confession of financial impropriety appeared sincere, and yet something remained unresolved in the geometry of the crime itself. "Mr. Thornton," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the library, "during your conversation with Mr. Hartwell this morning, did he strike you? Did he threaten you with violence?" Thornton looked up, surprised by the question. "No, Miss Marple. He was coldly furious, utterly contemptuous, but he did not threaten violence. Reginald was not a man given to physical displays of emotion. His cruelty was primarily verbal and financial in nature. And yet you remained at Thornfield Manor for the garden party," Miss Marple continued. "A man who had just confessed to embezzling from his employer, a man facing the prospect of criminal prosecution and professional ruin, would ordinarily leave such a gathering immediately. Why did you not depart?" This question seemed to agitate Thornton considerably. "Because Mr. Hartwell asked me to remain. He said he wished to observe me during the party, to watch how I conducted myself in social circumstances, now that he knew the truth about me. He seemed to derive some particular satisfaction from my continued presence and discomfort." Inspector Blackwell set aside the ledger and regarded Thornton with intensifying skepticism. "So you remained at the party, fully aware that at 4 o'clock you would be confronted privately by a man who intended to prosecute you for embezzlement, and you made no attempt to flee or to prevent this confrontation from occurring." "What could I do, Inspector? To flee would have been to confirm why guilt and render prosecution inevitable. To attempt to prevent the confrontation would have been impossible. I simply remained, as requested, and waited for the appointed hour when my professional life would end. Miss Marple's eyes had narrowed, and she continued to observe Thornton with the penetrating gaze of someone who perceived incongruities in his narrative. "Mr. Thornton, at what point did you become aware that Mr. Hartwell was dead?" When Mrs. Hartwell screamed, Thornton replied, "I was in the drawing room with the others when we heard her cry from the kitchen. We all rushed to see what had occurred, and I witnessed the body along with everyone else." "And your initial reaction?" the inspector asked. "Shock, naturally. Relief, if I am being entirely honest. The crisis I had been dreading was suddenly, inexplicably, resolved. The man who had intended to destroy me was dead, and with him died the immediate threat to my career and my family's security." Inspector Blackwell studied Thornton carefully, weighing his confession and confession of relief against the physical evidence of the crime. "Mr. Thornton, I must ask you directly, did you strike Mr. Reginald Hartwell this afternoon?" "No, Inspector, I did not," Thornton replied, and there was something in the quality of his denial that carried unmistakable conviction. "I am guilty of financial impropriety, certainly, and I am guilty of desperation, but I am not guilty of murder. When Mrs. Hartwell screamed, Mr. Hartwell was already dead." Miss Marple's needles paused in their clicking, and her gaze turned toward the library window, where the rain continued its relentless assault against the glass. She understood now that the investigation had not yet reached its conclusion, that a second murderer remained unidentified, and that the true architecture of the crime remained to be fully revealed. Inspector Black. Well, released David Thornton pending further investigation, though he made clear that the solicitor was not to leave the village without explicit permission. As Thornton departed the library, his shoulders hunched with the weight of impending consequences, the inspector turned his full attention to the remaining puzzle pieces that refused to align into a coherent pattern. "There is something troubling about this entire scenario," Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles having resumed their steady rhythm. "Mr. Thornton possessed motive, certainly, but the physical evidence of the crime does not align with what one would expect if he were the perpetrator. A man in his profession, accustomed to careful documentation and attention to detail, would not commit murder in such a crude and apparently accidental manner." Inspector Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in an attitude of deep concentration. "You're suggesting that someone else struck the fatal blow?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that we have been examining this crime through an excessively narrow lens. We have focused our attention upon Mr. Thornton because his financial impropriety provided an obvious motive and because he was conveniently present at the critical time. Yet motive and opportunity do not necessarily indicate guilt, particularly when other individuals within this household possess motives that are perhaps more complicated and more desperate than simple financial preservation." The inspector's eyes sharpened with renewed interest. "You have a theory, Miss Marple?" "Not a theory precisely," Miss Marple demurred, "but rather a series of observations that seem to require explanation. First, there is the matter of the missing ledger. According to Mrs. Evans, Mr. Hartwell carried it downstairs at 11:30 this morning. Yet when we examine Ned, his study, this ledger was not present. Mr. Thornton's briefcase contains it, certainly, but one must ask how it arrived there. Did Mr. Hartwell place it in the briefcase himself, or did someone else remove it from the kitchen and transfer it to Mr. Thornton's possession? You're suggesting that the ledger was moved after the murder was committed?" the inspector asked. "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that the timing and sequence of events requires more careful examination than we have thus far undertaken. Second, there is the matter of the water on the kitchen floor. We observed that the floor was damp in a specific location near the sink, yet Mrs. Evans had cleaned the kitchen this morning, and the floor would have been dry by mid-afternoon. The damp patch therefore suggests recent activity in that location, but not necessarily the activity that resulted in Mr. Hartwell's death." Inspector Blackwell rose and began to pace, his mind clearly working through the implications of Miss Marple's observations. "You're suggesting that Mr. Hartwell was not killed in the kitchen where we found him?" I am suggesting, Miss Marple continued, that the evidence does not conclusively support that conclusion. If Mr. Hartwell fell and struck his head on the counter, we would expect to find evidence of blood on the counter surface itself, or hair, or some physical trace of contact. Yet the kitchen counter appears entirely clean. The inspector's pace quickened, and he returned to the library table where the various documents and evidence remained arranged. He studied the photographs that Sergeant Foster had taken of the kitchen scene, examining them with new perspective. The blow to the head, he murmured, could have been delivered elsewhere, and the body subsequently moved to the kitchen to simulate an accidental fall. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. And if that is case, then we must consider which individuals within this household possessed the physical strength to move a body of considerable weight, the presence of mind to arrange the scene in a manner that would suggest accident, and the emotional motivation to commit such an act. Catherine Hartwell, the inspector said suddenly, understanding crystallizing in his expression. Her father had refused to fund her education, had crushed her aspirations, had trapped her in a provincial existence when she possessed the intellect and ambition to transcend it. And now, with his death, his estate passes to her in equal share with her brother. She would be financially independent for the first time in her life. A plausible theory, Miss Marple acknowledged, yet I must confess that my observations suggest a somewhat different conclusion. Miss Catherine, while certainly capable of experiencing rage at her father's treatment, does not strike me as a woman driven to violence by thwarted ambition. She is too controlled, too accustomed to suppressing her emotions and accepting her circumstances with quiet resignation. Then who? The inspector demanded, frustration creeping into his tone. Who within this household possessed both motive and opportunity? Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to her feet with the careful deliberation of age. She moved to the library window and gazed out at the rain-swept grounds of Thornfield Manor, her aged eyes seeming to perceive something beyond the immediate physical landscape. "Inspector," she said quietly, without turning from the window, "I must ask you a question. When we examined Mr. Hartwell's study, did you notice the position of the leather wing-back chair behind his desk?" "I noted that it appeared to be positioned directly behind the desk," the inspector replied, puzzlement evident in his tone. "And yet, when we were there, did you observe any displacement on the floor that might suggest the chair had been recently moved? Any marks or scratches that would indicate it had been pushed backward with some force?" The inspector's face underwent a transformation as comprehension began to dawn. "You're suggesting that the chair was deliberately repositioned, that someone stood behind the desk chair and—" He did not complete the sentence, but the implications hung heavy in the air between them. Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression carrying the weight of terrible certainty. "I believe, Inspector," she said quietly, "that it is time to examine more carefully the movements and emotional state of Mrs. Constance Hartwell during the critical hours of this afternoon." Inspector Blackwell's request for Mrs. Constance Hartwell to return to the library was delivered with studied courtesy, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of official authority. She entered moments later, her composure apparently restored, though Miss Marple observed the tension that radiated from her carefully maintained facade. She wore the expression of a woman preparing herself for an ordeal she had anticipated but hoped to avoid. "Mrs. Hartwell," the inspector began, his tone gentler than his words might suggest, "I wonder if you might clarify the sequence of events this afternoon. Specifically, I am interested in your movements between the time the garden party commenced and the moment you discovered your husband's body in the kitchen." Mrs. Hartwell seated herself with studied grace, her hands folding in her lap with the precision that characterized her every movement. "I was occupied with my guests, Inspector, ensuring they were comfortable, attending to refreshments, managing the various social obligations that such gatherings require. I was in the drawing room for most of the afternoon, and you did not go to the stud. Why to speak with your husband at any point?" "No, Inspector. As I have stated, my husband preferred not to be disturbed during social gatherings. It was understood between us that he would remain in his study during the party." Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her aged presence somehow commanding despite her diminutive stature. "Mrs. Hartwell," When you entered the kitchen this afternoon at approximately 4:30, what was your stated purpose in going there?" Mrs. Hartwell's composure flickered, just barely perceptibly. "To fetch additional teacups, as I explained to Inspector Blackwell. And yet," Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness, "the kitchen already contained an adequate supply of teacups. Your guests were not lacking in refreshments. Indeed, your housekeeper, Mrs. Evans, had set out sufficient dishes for a gathering twice the size of your actual party. Why would you need to retrieve additional cups?" The silence that followed this question was profound and heavy with implication. Mrs. Hartwell's jaw tightened, and her fingers gripped the fabric of her dress with increasing pressure. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its carefully maintained firmness. "I went to the kitchen to prepare myself privately for a moment. The stress of hosting, the presence of so many people, I needed a brief respite." "A respite," Inspector Blackwell repeated thoughtfully. "Yet when you screamed and brought the household rushing to the kitchen, you were allegedly discovering your husband's body for the first time. How did you react so immediately and with such apparent shock if you had merely gone there for quiet reflection?" "I saw him and was naturally horrified," Mrs. Hartwell replied, but her voice had become strained, the careful control slipping incrementally away. Miss Marple moved closer, her expression carrying compassion rather than accuser. "Tion, Mrs. Hartwell, you have been a devoted wife for many years, have you not? A woman who has managed this household with meticulous care, who has organized countless social gatherings, who has maintained order and propriety in all circumstances. And yet throughout all those years, you have endured a husband who was emotionally distant, financially controlling, and increasingly tyrannical in his assertions of authority." Mrs. Hartwell's hands began to tremble, though she attempted to conceal the tremor by gripping them more tightly. "I have observed that your left wrist bears the marks of recent bruising, Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple continued, her voice remaining gentle. "Bruising that appears consistent with being gripped forcefully. When did your husband injure you?" "That is none of your concern," Mrs. Hartwell said, but her voice had become barely above a whisper. "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed, "but it is relevant to understanding the events of this afternoon. Your husband discovered Mr. Thornton's financial impropriety and determined to report him to the authorities. Yet reporting Mr. Thornton would inevitably expose the family to scandal, to public examination of the Hartwell name and circumstances. Your daughter's future would be compromised, your son's reputation would suffer, and your own position as matriarch of the household would be permanently diminished." Inspector Blackwell's understanding crystallized with visible intensity. "You went to the study to speak with your husband about Mr. Thornton's situation. You attempted to persuade him not to proceed with his accusations." Mrs. Hartwell's face crumpled, though she maintained her rigid posture. "I asked him to reconsider. I explained that reporting Mr. Thornton would destroy a family, would create scandal that would affect us all. I begged him to show mercy, to allow Mr. Thornton to repay the fund, privately without legal intervention. But Reginald refused. He said that such actions were beneath his dignity, that the law must be satisfied regardless of personal consequences." "And he struck you when you persisted?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally fractured entirely. "He grabbed my wrist and twisted it painfully. He told me that I was a fool for even suggesting such weakness, that the Hartwell name would be protected through strict adherence to legal propriety. He said that my sentimental notions about Mr. Thornton's family were irrelevant to matters of law and honor. He dismissed me from the study with contempt." "And you did not leave," Inspector Blackwell said, understanding the sequence of events with sudden clarity. "You remained in the study, or you returned moments later when your rage had crystallized into something more purposeful?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice, when she finally spoke again, was so quiet that all present had to lean forward to hear her words. "I went to his study after I had composed myself. I found him sitting at his desk reviewing Mr. Thornton's financial records. I stood behind his chair, and I remembered every moment of humiliation I had endured from that man. Every criticism, every dismissal, every instance in which my thoughts and feelings had been treated as insignificant. I remembered my daughter's tears when father refused to fund her education. I remembered my son's resignation to a life of mediocrity because father controlled the family's resources so completely. She paused, her hands trembling uncontrollably now. The leather lamp base was on the desk beside me. It was heavier than I anticipated. I did not strike him with the intention of killing him. I simply wanted to make him understand, to force him to comprehend the pain his cruelty had inflicted. But the blow was harder than I had anticipated. Anne. He fell forward against the desk. When I realized what I had done, what I had actually accomplished, I panicked. "You moved him to the kitchen to simulate an accidental fall," Miss Marple said quietly. "You arranged the stool, dampened the floor, and waited for someone to discover him. I placed his ledger in Mr. Thornton's briefcase while everyone was gathered in the drawing room," Mrs. Hartwell admitted, her voice barely audible. "I thought that if suspicion fell upon Mr. Thornton, if the focus remained on his financial crimes, the accidental fall scenario would be accepted. No one would question it too closely." Inspector Blackwell signaled to Sergeant Foster, who moved forward to take Mrs. Constance Hartwell into custody. As she rose to accompany the sergeant, she seemed to diminish before their eyes, her carefully maintained composure replaced by the hollow devastation of a woman whose entire world had collapsed into ruin. Miss Marple watched her depart with an expression of profound sadness, and she returned to her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the oppressive silence that had settled over Thornfield Manor.